3 straight days trapped indoors by rain? You've got a roof, a heater, a stocked fridge, a phone full of noise to kill the boredom, and you're still restless, still irritated, still counting the hours until it stops. Now take all of that away. No roof, no walls, no dry blanket, no stored food, no jacket built to shed water. Drop yourself into a forest in Ice Age Europe 60,000 years ago, in the middle of a rainy season that refuses to break for weeks. The air sits just above the temperature that ends a human life. This isn't a thought experiment for the people who lived it. It was Tuesday. It was every week for months at a time. And somehow, generation after generation, they didn't just survive that world. They spread across some of the wettest, coldest, most punishing landscapes on the planet and thrived in them. Ask most people what threatened early humans, and you'll hear the same answers. Saber-toothed cats, harsh winters, rival tribes, the long walk out of Africa. Almost nobody mentions rain. It doesn't roar, it doesn't stalk, it isn't dramatic enough for a documentary cold open. But rain drowned out fires that took hours to build. It rotted stored food into mush. It flooded shelters at 3 in the morning. And it did all of this quietly, repeatedly, for months at a stretch, in a way no predator ever could sustain. Pound for pound, across a human lifetime, rain likely killed more people than teeth and claws combined. So the real question isn't how ancient humans escaped the jaws of a lion. It's how they outthought something as patient, relentless, and utterly indifferent as the sky.
Here's the actual killer hiding inside every rainy night. Heat loss, not drowning. Water pulls warmth out of a human body roughly 25 times faster than air does. That number sounds abstract until you feel what it means. It's the gap between sitting in a chilly room and sitting in a cold lake while your body quietly shuts down. Once your skin and clothing are soaked, your metabolism may not replace heat as fast as the rain is stealing it, especially with even a light wind moving across wet skin. This is exactly why hypothermia kills so efficiently in weather nowhere near freezing. You don't need snow, you need wet clothing, a mild breeze, and a temperature around 10 degrees Celsius. That's an ordinary spring evening. That's a normal British summer. That's the exact condition early humans faced constantly across dozens of environments for their entire existence. Ancient humans didn't learn this from a textbook on thermodynamics. They learned it by watching people die from conditions that looked, on the surface, completely survivable, and that hard lesson reordered their entire list of survival priorities. Finding food mattered, building shelter mattered, but neither mattered if your core temperature slipped past the point of no return first. Keeping the body's internal furnace running took priority over almost everything else the moment rain started falling, and the strategies they built around that single problem turn out to be far more sophisticated than most people assume. It starts with the most obvious tool available and also the trickiest one to keep alive once the sky opens up: fire. Because fire and rain have always been enemies, and losing that fight in a hypothermic moment isn't an inconvenience, it's a death sentence.
Wet wood doesn't ignite, wet tinder doesn't catch, and starting a fire from nothing using only bare hands and raw materials ranks among the hardest physical skills a human being can attempt, and rain makes it exponentially worse. So ancient humans stopped treating fire like something you create in the moment you need it. They treated it the way we treat electricity, as infrastructure, maintained constantly, never allowed to fully die. Across cultures studied from the Arctic to Australia, carrying fire was a practiced, deliberate skill. Smouldering embers got wrapped in slow-burning material, damp moss, certain fungus, specific bark, and carried for hours while a group travelled. Some peoples packed glowing coals into sealed containers. Others chose particular tree species purely because their wood smouldered slowly enough to survive a journey. Archaeological sites across Europe show hearths that stayed lit continuously for years at a time, not rebuilt from scratch again and again, but tended like a living thing. That kind of continuous fire required a job, not hunting, not foraging, sitting beside the flame, shielding it from wind and rain, feeding it exactly enough to survive the night without burning through the group's fuel supply. This is one of the earliest divisions of labor we can actually see in the archaeological record, earlier, in some cases, than dedicated toolmakers or healers. Before anyone specialized in a weapon or a cure, someone specialized in keeping a group from waking up cold and in complete darkness during a storm. It sounds almost too simple to count as a real skill, but losing that fire meant losing warmth, cooked food, protection, and light, all at once, all during exactly the weather conditions that made rebuilding it nearly impossible. The firekeeper's job might be the least glamorous role in prehistoric life. It may also have been one of the most essential.
But fire has one unavoidable dependency. It needs cover to survive a real downpour. And that forces us to look at what ancient shelter actually was, because the popular picture of it is mostly wrong. Most people imagine early humans as cave dwellers, huddled in stone. That image exists mainly because caves preserve evidence well, so that's where archaeologists keep finding things, not because most people actually lived in them. Caves are rare, often cold and damp themselves, frequently already occupied by predators, and geographically limited to begin with. The truth is that most ancient humans lived in structures they built by hand, and even the earliest of those structures reveal a level of environmental problem-solving that still holds up today. Strip away the cave myth entirely, and a far more interesting picture appears, one built from nothing but branches, leaves, patience, and generations of hard-won trial and error. The oldest known built shelters date back roughly 400,000 years, long before our own species even existed. They weren't elaborate, but they weren't accidental either. Branches were deliberately angled to shed water downward instead of pooling on top. Leaves were layered in overlapping rows, each one covering the seam of the one beneath it, so rain ran off the surface instead of soaking through, the exact same principle behind a modern roof. A hominid species with a noticeably smaller brain than ours worked that out independently, with zero engineering education, purely through trial, failure, and paying close attention to what kept water out and what let it in. That single insight, overlap your layers, angle your surfaces, shows up again and again across completely unrelated cultures, separated by hundreds of thousands of years, because it simply works.
By the time fully modern humans were spreading across the globe, temporary shelters had become remarkably advanced given the materials on hand. Heavy bones anchored into the ground to resist wind, animal hides stretched tightly across the frame, layers underneath that likely functioned as insulation. These weren't holes to hide inside, they were engineered environments, purpose-built to hold heat in and keep moisture out. And that hide stretched across the frame deserves its own spotlight, because turning raw animal skin into a genuinely waterproof material wasn't a small technical trick. It was one of the most important material inventions in the entire human story, and it happened specifically as an answer to cold, wet climates. Properly prepared animal hide is close to waterproof on its own. The natural fat content already resists moisture fairly well. But ancient humans pushed further, scraping the hide clean, stretching it, treating it with fat or brain tissue or even urine, then smoking it over a fire. That full process is essentially the invention of leather. And leather is a remarkable material, flexible enough to move with the body, durable enough to last, insulating when dry, and far more water-resistant than any woven plant fiber available at the time. The cognitive leap required to get there is bigger than it sounds. It means looking at a dead animal and recognizing that its skin, treated correctly over several days of deliberate work, can protect your own skin weeks later in weather that hasn't even arrived yet. That's not instinct. That's planning across a timeline no immediate reward explains.
Understanding cause and effect that far removed from the original action is genuinely abstract thinking, and the evidence says humans were doing it early. Hide-scraping tools found in Africa date back at least 120,000 years and possibly further. That predates what researchers typically consider the arrival of fully modern behavior, which suggests staying dry was a strong enough evolutionary pressure on its own to push complex problem-solving forward ahead of schedule. Rain didn't just threaten ancient humans, it appears to have actively shaped how their minds developed. And once fire was contained, shelter was engineered, and hide was waterproofed, the next survival skill had nothing to do with materials at all. It was about noticing things, reading a landscape and a sky the way we now read a weather app, except with no app, no delay, and no margin for being wrong. Modern life has mostly outsourced weather awareness to a phone screen. Ancient humans had no such shortcut, so their survival depended on reading the environment constantly, catching signals long before rain actually arrived. The smell in the air right before a storm, that distinctive earthy scent scientists call petrichor, is a genuine detectable signal, and so is animal behavior shifting hours in advance. Birds fly noticeably lower, insects swarm differently, certain animals move deliberately toward higher ground, cloud shape and color, sudden shifts in wind direction, even subtle changes in how a lake or river's surface moves, all of it carries real, readable meteorological information. Ancient humans absorbed these cues the way you glance at a traffic light, automatically, fluently, without conscious effort, because getting it wrong cost far more than a wet afternoon.
Groups likely made shelter decisions hours before the first drop fell, based purely on accumulated environmental literacy passed down for generations. You don't get caught out in a downpour when you've been reading the sky all day and you still have 3 hours of daylight left to reach higher ground and finish a rain cover before the storm actually hits. Researchers studying present-day traditional communities still find this kind of environmental fluency almost unsettling to outside observers. Trackers who can read weather and animal movement from the same set of signs, predicting the next several hours with real accuracy. It isn't mystical, it's expertise, refined daily, tested constantly against real consequences, and taught deliberately from one generation to the next. Somewhere along the line, most of us traded that fluency for a 5-day forecast on a screen. Reading the sky was only half the equation. Reading the ground mattered just as much. Cold air sinks and pools in low ground, so on a wet night, camping on a slight rise instead of a hollow could mean the difference between waking up merely damp and waking up sitting in several inches of freezing water. South-facing slopes dry faster after rain. Dense broadleaf canopy can intercept a large share of light rainfall before it even reaches the ground, and certain rock formations create natural overhangs, not because ancient humans couldn't build their own shelter, but because a good overhang was a head start that saved hours of construction. Groups return to the same reliable spots for generations, which is exactly why archaeologists keep finding repeated layers of ash and bone stacked at identical locations over and over across thousands of years. The good spots were remembered, and they were passed on.
Beyond behavior and knowledge, ancient humans likely carried real physiological advantages in cold, wet conditions, advantages many of us have quietly lost through comfortable, climate-controlled living. Take the cold shock response, the sharp gasp, the rapid breathing, the cardiovascular jolt that hits the moment a body enters cold water. It's largely automatic, and it's responsible for a surprising number of cold water drowning deaths, even among strong swimmers. But that response is partly trainable. People regularly exposed to cold water, cold weather, repeated cold showers show a measurably reduced shock response over time because the body adapts to what it's asked to handle. Ancient humans were cold and wet on a near daily basis, in a way that's almost impossible to replicate inside a heated, insulated modern home. Their baseline reaction to cold wasn't just different from ours, it was calibrated day after day by an environment that never offered a thermostat to turn up. There's also strong evidence around fat distribution and metabolism.
Populations living in consistently cold, wet climates tend to show higher resting metabolic rates in cold conditions, along with more efficient heat production from brown adipose tissue, a specialized type of fat that generates warmth directly instead of just storing energy. Some of this is genetic, shaped by generations of selection pressure. Some of it is simply physiological, maintained through regular, repeated cold exposure. The Inuit remain the most studied example of this adaptation, but research increasingly shows that any human exposed to consistent cold develops at least some version of these same responses, regardless of ancestry. Ancient humans in brutal, wet climates weren't surviving in spite of their bodies had been shaped over a lifetime and over generations specifically to handle exactly those conditions. Not superior humans, trained ones.
Surviving rain alone is genuinely difficult. Surviving it as a coordinated group is dramatically more manageable. And ancient social structures were built in real part around managing exactly this kind of shared environmental threat. Shared body heat is a legitimate survival mechanism. A cluster of people huddled together under cover retains warmth collectively in a way no individual can match alone. The person on the outer edge stays colder than the person at the center, and ancient groups clearly understood this because sleeping arrangements in cold, wet conditions were dense, communal, and entirely practical. Privacy is a comfort available in good weather. When the temperature drops and the rain won't stop, you sleep pressed against other warm bodies without a second thought, because the alternative is a body that stops generating enough heat to make it to morning. Firekeeping was just one piece of a much larger system of weather-related labor. Anthropologists studying groups facing bad weather consistently find an implicit division of tasks. Younger, more physically capable members maintain the fire and gather supplies. Older members with deeper experience make the calls on shelter placement and when to move. And children stay physically central, surrounded and warmed by the bodies around them. The group itself functioned as a thermoregulation system, not merely a social one, which is exactly why the image of a lone caveman surviving entirely by himself against the elements is mostly modern fiction. A trained individual can survive brief exposure alone. Surviving an entire rainy season, week after week, required a functioning group, full stop. No amount of individual toughness substitutes for a team that keeps the fire fed, the children warm, and the decisions sound when the weather refuses to let up.
None of the specific techniques, ember-carrying methods, hide waterproofing steps, the particular trees whose bark smolders slowly enough to transport were reinvented from scratch by every new generation. They were taught directly, passed down through observation, correction, and hands-on practice. A group's accumulated environmental knowledge was arguably its single most valuable asset, and losing an experienced elder to illness or violence meant losing irreplaceable institutional memory, not just a person. That's very likely one reason care for older, non-productive group members appears surprisingly early in the archaeological record, not sentimentality in the abstract sense, but the rational protection of knowledge the whole group depended on to survive the next wet season. Every technique still in use had, at some point, an old voice behind it saying, "Watch closely, because one day you'll need to know this yourself." Rain didn't pause hunger either, and prolonged wet weather created its own specific food problem. Animals shelter and become far harder to track. Reliable plant foods, seeds, dried berries, diggable roots turn waterlogged, buried under mud, or simply vanish for days at a stretch, right as cold weather increases the body's caloric demands. Ancient humans met this squeeze with genuine foresight. Deliberate food storage appears deep in the archaeological record. Caches of nuts, dried meat, and preserved fish tucked into cool, elevated, or hidden locations specifically to bridge the gap between today's abundance and tomorrow's shortage. They also shifted targets opportunistically toward whatever the rain itself produced. Earthworms surfacing by the thousands, freshwater fish moving predictably during floods, certain mushrooms fruiting heavily in wet conditions. The menu changed with the weather, because rigid habits don't survive unpredictable seasons. Flexibility wasn't a personality trait here, it was a requirement.
And this reshapes the entire picture of where ancient humans actually chose to settle. Modern populations generally cluster in moderate, stable climates. You can see it clearly on any population density map today. Ancient humans didn't have that luxury, and in many cases didn't even want it. They pushed into monsoon-drenched Southeast Asia, into perpetually wet coastal forests, into river deltas that flooded on a predictable seasonal cycle, into subarctic regions where the ground stayed wet or frozen for most of the year. They went there partly because of what the rain created: rivers full of fish, forests thick with fungi and game, soil rich enough to support dense, reliable food webs. The difficulty of managing wet conditions was apparently a fair trade for the abundance those same conditions produced. So this is the real story hiding under the popular image of primitive cavemen. A tended fire passed hand to hand for generations, a waterproofed hide stretched across bent mammoth bone, a shelter built in 3 hours because someone read the sky correctly, a group sleeping in a tight circle because that's what got everyone to morning alive. Every drainage system, insulated wall, and waterproof jacket we take for granted today is downstream of that same wet, freezing night repeated for 100,000 years until someone finally figured it out. That's not primitive, that's the foundation everything else was built on. If ancient survival stories like this one pull you in, subscribe. This channel goes deep into the parts of prehistory nobody else covers.